So something unusual just happened inside the G7 this week. 6 of the most powerful democracies all agreed on one thing. Sanctions on Russia should stay in place. And then the United States did the exact opposite.
And that's the heart of the story this week. While Russia is still fighting that brutal war in Ukraine, the Trump administration announced a temporary pause on sanctions for Russian oil shipments that were stranded at sea. The official reason was to stabilize global oil prices after the war involving Iran disrupted energy markets.
But here's the problem. Sanctions on Russian oil weren't random economic policies. They were the main tool that the West has used to weaken the Kremlin's ability to finance its war in Ukraine. Russia's economy runs heavily on oil and gas exports. When those exports are restricted, then Moscow loses the money it uses to fund its military.
Which is why the reaction from America's closest allies was immediate. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood alongside German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store in northern Norway, and he made Canada's position crystal clear. Canada will not ease sanctions on Russian oil.
And Merz backed that up by saying that 6 of the 7 countries agreed that those sanctions should stay in place. 6 out of 7. As we know, the only country that disagreed was the US.
And that's an extraordinary split inside the G7. These sanctions have been one of the most coordinated economic pressure campaigns in modern history. And suddenly, the country that helped lead that effort decided to step away from it.
The U.S. Treasury says the move is temporary, a 30-day waiver allowing oil already loaded on tankers to be sold in order to calm global energy markets. Oil prices spiked after fighting in the Middle East disrupted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which normally carries about 20% of the world's oil supply.
But here's the awkward part. Even after the sanction waiver, oil prices are still high. Surprise! Brent crude briefly dipped and then it shot right back above $100 a barrel, which means the argument that this was necessary to stabilize the market, it doesn't add up.
Meanwhile, Russia still benefits because every barrel of oil that reaches the market puts more money into the Kremlin's pocket. Oil and gas exports make up roughly a quarter of Russia's federal revenue. Analysts estimate that the waiver could unlock tens of millions of barrels of crude that have been stuck on ships due to those sanctions. Some economists actually say that could translate into billions of dollars flowing back into the Russian economy. And that money, where does it go? It funds the military. It buys missiles, drones, artillery shells, the equipment that Russia's using in Ukraine.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that even a limited easing could give Russia around $10 billion to fund its war effort. Every dollar earned from that oil export eventually becomes the artillery used against the Ukrainian cities.
So the rest of the G7 is asking a very simple question. If prices didn't drop and Russia still profits, why lift sanctions in the first place? And that question gets even stranger when you actually zoom out and look at the bigger picture that's been happening.
Yeah, because the Kremlin certainly didn't hide its satisfaction. Russian officials openly celebrated the decision, and Putin's economic envoy said that the move proves something that Moscow has been arguing for years, that the global energy market cannot function without Russian oil.
Now, here's where things get more uncomfortable, because this decision didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after a moment that already had people raising their eyebrows across the Western alliance.
Yeah, let's look back to August 2025. Anchorage, Alaska. Putin lands at a U.S. military base. This is the same Vladimir Putin wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes connected to the deportation of Ukrainian children.
And instead of diplomatic isolation, he gets a red carpet welcome. American troops roll out a carpet right on the runway. Donald Trump stands waiting, claps as Putin walks down the stairs and greets him with a warm handshake.
The images were extraordinary. Fighter jets overhead, cameras everywhere. At one point, Putin even climbed into Trump's armored presidential limousine, the Beast, and cameras caught him laughing as they drove away.
It was a disgusting display. Now, for the Kremlin, It was a public relations victory that they could never have imagined. Russia had spent the past 3 years under Western isolation, and suddenly its president was being welcomed onto American soil like a respected negotiating partner.
The summit was supposed to be about ending the war in Ukraine, but when the meeting ended, there was no ceasefire, there was no agreement, and no concessions were made from Russia at all.
Note, Putin repeated the same demands he's made since the beginning of the war, that Ukraine accept Russian control over occupied territory and give up key elements of its sovereignty. Those demands effectively amount to Ukraine just surrendering. Putin, meanwhile, well, he walked away with exactly what he wanted, right? Photographs showing him welcomed by the President of the United States. Proof that the Western alliance was no longer treating him as an untouchable aggressor.
And listen, Dave, that meeting also fit into a broader pattern that has defined Trump's relationship with Russia for decades. Long before he entered politics, Trump often spoke admiringly about Putin. Over the years, he described him as smart, a strong leader, and someone who had outmaneuvered American presidents.
Then there are the financial connections that have raised eyebrows for years. Trump pursued business deals in Russia for decades, including a Trump Tower project in Moscow that continued during his 2016 campaign. Members of his own family acknowledged that Russian investors were heavily involved in Trump Organization properties.
And remember the Helsinki summit in 2018? Standing next to Putin, Trump publicly questioned the findings of his own intelligence agencies about Russian election interference. The agencies said that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to help Trump. Putin denied it, of course, and Trump said he had no reason to believe it was Russia.
Now, that moment alone stunned diplomats everywhere around the world. The President of the United States appeared to side with the Kremlin over his own intelligence community.
Well, of course he did, Dave. If Putin helped him win, why would he say otherwise?
True. That's why people keep circling back to this same question. Is this simply chaotic policymaking during a global energy crisis, or is there a pattern here?
Yeah, because that pattern has stretched for years. While Trump praises Putin, he repeatedly criticizes NATO, the alliance created specifically to counter Russian military power. And he's questioned whether the United States should even defend allied countries.
And now we have the newest piece of that puzzle. Easing sanctions on Russian oil right when those sanctions were finally starting to hurt the Russian economy.
Which leads us to another uncomfortable question that people are starting to ask. The Trump administration entered a war with Iran that disrupted global oil supplies and sent prices soaring. That price spark created justification for allowing Russian oil back onto the market.
So critics are asking something that would have sounded like a conspiracy theory a few years ago. Was all this part of the plan? Was the war with Iran always going to create the conditions that helped Russia's energy exports recover? Oil markets, they're in complete turmoil, and the policy response to that turmoil just happens to benefit Russia's biggest source of income.
We can't prove that Trump is controlled by Russia, but looking at the pattern, it does explain why so many intelligence officials, diplomats, and analysts continue to view the relationship with deep suspicion, because the outcome of these decisions often aligns with Putin and Russia's strategic interests.
And this is where the story does get bigger than just those sanctions, because while Washington is drifting in one direction, the rest of the democratic world is quietly moving in another. Look at where Mark Carney was standing when he made those remarks. Bardufoss, Norway, above the Arctic Circle. He was there observing NATO's cold response military exercise, where thousands of troops from multiple countries were training together in extreme winter conditions.
Those exercises were not just symbolic. Countries brought tanks, drones, special forces units, and heavy equipment into the Arctic to practice operating in some of the toughest environments on Earth. That kind of training only happens when governments are thinking seriously about security threats in that region. And the leaders watching those exercises together weren't random either. Canada, Germany, and Norway have suddenly become the key players in the new security architecture taking shape across Europe and the Arctic.
Germany in particular is going through a massive shift right now. For decades after the Second World War, Berlin kept its military role limited. Now it's dramatically increasing defense spending and rebuilding its armed forces. France is pushing in the exact same direction, with President Emmanuel Macron arguing that Europe needs what he calls strategic autonomy, the ability to defend itself even if American leadership becomes unreliable.
All across Northern Europe, the same pattern is unfolding. Finland joined NATO, Sweden joined NATO, Norway is expanding its Arctic defense capabilities, Denmark is investing billions into protecting Greenland and surrounding Arctic regions. Canada is also waking up to the strategic importance of the North, with Carney announcing that $35 billion investment in Arctic infrastructure and defense.
So when you line all these moves up together, something very clear starts to emerge. Democracies are preparing for a world where they may not be able to rely on the United States the way that they once did. For 80 years, the Western Alliance revolved around American leadership. NATO, the G7, and the broader security system all assumed that Washington would anchor the democratic world.
But the Iran war exposed something uncomfortable. When the United States launched strikes in the Middle East, almost nobody followed. Europe did not mobilize for the conflict. Canada did not mobilize for the conflict. Instead, most Western governments focused on containing the fallout, stabilizing energy markets, and preventing the war from spreading further.
And that's why sanction decisions matter so much. The G7's disagreement wasn't just about oil. It revealed a deeper divide inside the alliance.
It's a sad day because alliances rarely collapse overnight. They shift gradually as governments adapt to new realities. One disagreement here, one crisis there, one patsy president put into place? Possibly. And suddenly the structure of the global cooperation begins to change.
Because while Washington debates sanctions, waivers, and oil prices, the rest of the democratic world appears to be quietly preparing for a future where they carry more of the burden themselves.
Which brings us back to the question we started with. If easing sanctions helps Russia, if oil prices stayed high anyway, and if America's closest allies all oppose the move, then what exactly is the point? Because from the outside, it doesn't look like a coordinated strategy.
No, it looks like the rest of the world adjusting to chaos coming out of Washington.
And a lot of people start asking the same question that we are. Whose side is he actually on?
That's the question, isn't it? And that's where things stand right now. The rest of the democratic world looks like it's trying to hold the line.
So we want to hear from you. Do you think Donald Trump is acting like a Russian asset? Or do you think there's some bigger strategic plan that we just can't see yet?
Let us know in the comments. Reread them all, and the discussion in this community is always one of the best parts of these videos.
And if you want to keep the conversation going, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss the next video. And check out the links in the pinned comment,
where you can grab your own Planet D merch, join us over on Substack for deeper analysis, or become a member of the A-Team here on YouTube.
So thanks for watching, everyone. If you've made it this far, we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.